So I will say no more, and we will begin first with Ronald and QS. Thank you.
Just a few prefatory remarks, which will echo somewhat of what Stasis was saying about reservation and process. In fact, he and I talked about this briefly last night. Paul asked me to do this, and to speak on Edward in relationship to Fanon, because I'm working on currently a book on Fanon. And I was indeed quite reticent, and while I always come through in the end on occasional events like this, really in the 11th hour sent them a note saying I'm sorely tempted just to back out, not simply because of overwork, but because of a certain reservation about not only the commemorative, but also anything that I could say at all that might be worthwhile, what I understood to be the tone of this gathering. Of course, a collection of individuals whose ideas on it, whose feelings I'm rather familiar with, but also more importantly, apropos of the work, in the course of the work, I've attended to a problem of address and haven't quite found out the right way to do, to address this question of address, which is more than merely a question of translatability. So I'm going to try to do that by framing what I'm going to present, which has certain polemics in it, and framing it in a way that I have found of late is the only mode I have available for addressing the problem of address, which is a mode that I abhor, and that is the autobiographical anecdote. So I come to Edward as a seminarian at the Oslo University in the year 1977, which is the second year of my studies there, where I've gone as a fundamentalist, having been an active member of the Islamic Party of North America, to become a sheikh, and it's the year in which I'm reaching a very specific crisis of faith. I've come to Al-Azhar in large measure because of something Fanon taught me, both in his proposition about the two metaphysical camps of Islam in the West, and his failure to bridge those two camps, and with an agenda to try and do so by becoming thoroughly and completely Islamicized, which of course entailed, as Nadine remarked rightly, a fundamental Arabization of a certain problem of imperialism. And by 77, there was a crisis in this project, and this crisis was resolved by coming upon a book called Orientalism, in which that book, expressly to my mind at that time, was addressing Fanon's question and my project, and gave me a very specific orientation that would lead me to a degree in philosophy and eventually comparative literature, in a way that was really in accord with what Edward himself said in the 2003 preface to Orientalism. And that was that this book played an important, or had an important place, to quote him, in the long and often interrupted history of the quest for human freedom. Freedom, what perhaps could that mean? Now, the title of my talk, Gods Always Fail, comes from an unexpected revisiting of this approach to Orientalism in Tunisia this October, in conversation with a preeminent Marxist theorist, Mundi Rassoumi, in talking about precisely the significance of coming to Islam through Marxism and back to Marxism, and the ways in which there's a Marxist element. And that's an irrelevant point. And how he was trying to work this out around the book that had been advised to him, called Elaha Tufshi Dayman by Edward Said. And, you know, I and Thomas Al-Omri are listening to him and saying, he wrote no such book. Gods will always fail. Right? What in the world could that be? And Rassoumi wanted to get this book that he told was a great book that explored this question, and sent me on a mission to try and find it. I did find it. It took me less than an hour, and that amazingly is the title for the Reich Lectures, Representations of the Intellectual. Why would that be the title in Arabic? Why must it be the failure of the gods in the plural? Now, if we accept the long one with Edward Said that what is irreducible and essential to human experience is subjective, and that this experience is also historical, then we are certainly brought to a vexing problem of thinking how to give an account of the relationship between the subjective and the historical. It can be pointed out that Said's claim is obviously not the polarity of the subjective and the historical, but only that the subjective is historical. It is historical as opposed to being transcended, either in accordance with the metaphysics of scholasticism and idealism, or the positivist empiricism of scientism. Yet, to simply state that the subjective experience is also historical is not only uninteresting, but prompts the question, how is historical experience possible? The weight of this question increases if we challenge the assumption that the subjective is essential to human experience. When we approach the work of Frantz Fanon, as I'm going to do with you this morning, with its persistent attempts to apprehend how and what we are in this world, we are inevitably brought to contemplate the subject of experience as a function of socially constituted processes. Or rather, Fanon calls us to pay some attention to the material historical processes, including symbolic economies, that occasion certain types of self in thinking. Now, to speak of the occasion for thinking is not just to imply the abstraction or purity of thought as purposeful process, in other words, an empty thought. The investment here is not an idealism, according to which the pure force of thought articulates the world. On the contrary, it is in that which prompted idealism, the capriciousness of thinking. In other words, what is of concern in our approaching Fanon here is what comes of occasional thinking. There are many strong and wonderfully subtle thinkers who come to mind as having grappled in insightful ways with this concern. But for the particular purposes of my remarks today, the focus remains on Fanon in light of Edward Said's engagement with the question of occasional thinking. Of course, it is well known by now that for Said it was in the occasion of thought that the will to think publicly is manifest. In this, he reiterated Nietzsche, discovering the oppositional, and for Said this was the radical nature of thinking as occasional. More precisely, it is in the occasion to think publicly that the identification of thinking with will, and so the challenge it poses to those forces and practices whose function it is to repress or exterminate will, is exhibited. Here, style is everything. Take, for example, the following expression. I try to examine the heterogeneity of colonial power and disclose the complicity of the two poles of that opposition as it constitutes the disciplinary enclaves of the critique of imperialism. Now, those of you who know Edward know that's not Edward. This expression is Gayatri Spivak's, which is quoted by Henry Louis Gates, Jr. in his 1991 essay, critical inquiry essay, entitled, of course, we know this, Critical Fanon. It's an important intervention. In order to reveal the investment of specific oppositional intellectuals in the work of Frantz Fanon as being merely academic, and so pseudo-oppositional. Occurring at a pivotal moment in his essay, when the course of a particular theoretical itinerary is plotted, Gates relates Spivak's critique of colonial discourse to Derrida's concept of writing. Accordingly, he interprets her statement, put in its strongest form, as entailing the corollary that all discourse is colonial. Now, Gates presented critical Fanon as an expose of how an itinerary can be charted through contemporary, what he called in a certain moment, colonial discourse theory, and we came to call post-colonial discourse theory, by tracking the presumably successive appropriations of the figure of Frantz Fanon as global theorist par excellence. Gates begins charting this itinerary with Edward Said's 1985 critical inquiry essay representing the colonized, Anthropology's Interlocutors, and concludes it with two of Albert Memmi's Fanon readings in his 1971 New York Times book review of Gessemer's Fanon and his 1968 Fanon and the Notion of Deficiency. Insofar as the field of Gates's itinerary is that of contemporary post-colonial discourse theory, as he called it, we are allowed to call it a schema of traveling through theory. And it is in the course of the traveling that the political stakes involved are laid bare, as Gates puts it. Fanon's current fascination for us has something to do with the convergence of the problematic of colonialism with the subject formation. And as a psychoanalyst of culture, as a champion of the wretched of the earth, he is an almost irresistible figure for a criticism that sees itself as both oppositional and postmodern. And yet, there is something Rashomon-like about his contemporary guise. His writings are highly porous, that is, wide open to interpretation, and the readings they elicit are as a result of unfailing symptomatic interest. Now, given the context, we are inclined to read the first sentence of this passage as saying something like, our current fascination with Fanon has something to do with the convergence of the problematic of colonialism with that of subject formation. To read it as such, however, is to overlook the genitive, Fanon's, which possesses the substantive's current in fascination. This expresses that the current fascination in question is Fanon's, and not ours with him, or for him. Again, given the context, this agrammaticality is easily enough overlooked, yet in overlooking it, we seem to have contextually two possible interpretations. These are the one already given, our current fascination with Fanon, etc., and the following. Fanon's fascination, being current for us, has something to do with the convergence of the problematic of colonialism with that of subject formation. This ambiguity is not, I think, just about an implicitist formulation. On the contrary, it discovers in this agrammatical moment what is at stake in the critical Fanon. Let us consider the difference between the two possible contextual interpretations of the sentence in relation to the rest of the passage. The first, our current fascination, is in keeping with the explicit trajectory of the itinerary. In this regard, it is worth noting that Gates evokes Said's representation of the colonized, or representing the colonized, forgive me, as a preeminent occasion in which Fanon is adduced as a figure of global post-colonial theory. In that essay, Said deploys Fanon, famously, as an indicator of postmodern theory's failure. And here the explicit reference is Jean-François Lyotard. Its failure to be adequate to the situatedness, Edwards' term, of all discourses in its diagnosing the absolute decline of grand narratives of liberation. Said's rejoinder to Lyotard is that this diagnosis is precipitous at best, neglecting the anti-imperialist challenge represented by Fanon and Césaire, that's Edward, by failing to, again, take them seriously as models or representations of human effort in the contemporary world. Gates's concern is that in using Fanon this way, Said engages in a theoretical over-totalization of the social reality of the anti-imperialist struggles, and so deracinates the situatedness of Fanon's own discourse. I mean, those of you know this is an important moment. This is where Black studies and post-colonial studies fall apart, right? Where diaspora and post-colonial studies fall apart, and it's the collapse of a certain kind of leftist project. Gates's reading of Said can be summarized as follows. On the one hand, Said calls for the recognition of the historical situation of all discourses. Lyotard is on par with Fanon's and Césaire's. In calling for such resignation, Said critically challenges the rigor of the claim that we've entered into an epoch of postmodernism, characterized by the foreclosure on grand narratives of liberation. At best, such a proposition can have no serious claim to globality, although it might retain affinities with the cultural imperialism attended with internationalism. If the discourses of the Third World are excluded from consideration as being ipso facto irrelevant. On the other hand, Said disregards his own call by typing Fanon with Césaire as a composite figure of the global theorist in Vacour, and so emptying him of his own specificity, quickly recognizing this composite as an ethnographic construct in which individuality of the colonized is drowned in an anonymous collectivity. Gates reads it as being symptomatic of an entrenched Eurocentric bias when it comes to the history of thought. This investment in a usable Fanon is not to be held against Said, however, because it is understandable in terms of the crisis of authority plaguing his own counter-narrative of post-colonial criticism. Said's allegorization of Fanon is interpreted as the site of counter-hegemonic agency. Said terms it the oppositional intellectual, and as also being a rejoinder to those like Homi Bhabha who've charged him with ignoring the self-representations of the colonized, and so implying that thoughtful power resides only in the discourses of the colonizer. Said's interest in Fanon, by Gates's account, involves a denégation. Now, let's consider the second possible contextual interpretation of Gates's formulation, and that is, Fanon's fascination being current for us has something to do with the convergence of the problematic of colonialism with that of subject formation. In this case, the overarching question for Gates is, what is the logic of selecting exempla? The problem with Said's reading of Fanon, then, is a forgetfulness of the function of discourse in relation to power. It is here that Gates deploys Spivak's expression in quotation. I'm critical with the binary opposition of colonizer-colonial. I try to examine the heterogeneity of colonial power and to disclose the complicity of the two poles, that the opposition as it constitutes the disciplinary enclave of the critique of imperialism. Relating the critique of colonial discourse to Derrida's concept of writing. And when colonial discourse theory is identified with writing in this way, it is recognized as being no more than the disciplinary enclave of the critique of imperialism. Accordingly, Gates interprets the expression, again, to include that all discourse is colonial, including the opposition intellectual. And this corollary, according to Gates, is a foregone conclusion of the psychoanalytic model of culture. Hence, the legitimacy of his own reading of Fanon as the psychoanalyst of culture, as a champion of the wretched of the earth. Now, a perhaps irresolvable tension between the two aspects of Fanon appears at the point of this corollary. The allegory of Fanon as an exemplary oppositional intellectual who represents to power those who cannot speak for themselves is traced along the horizontal axis, whose focus, of course, is les damnés de terre, the wretched of the earth. In opposition to this, Gates traces a vertical axis, whose focus is, of course, on noir masque blanc, black skin, white mask, along which Fanon, the black European, produces the figure of the wretched Algerian as an allegory for his own sense of split consciousness, as well as that of the new man as the romantic construction of what he became in order to forget what he is. In this uncharitable reading of Fanon, which is Albert Memmi's, Gates finds a Fanon that is emphatically not the Fanon we have recuperated for global colonial discourse theory. Not only is this Fanon not the organic oppositional intellectual of the Third World, but the jewel of his thought, that the new man emerges in the course of the colonial wars, is taken as a symptom of the very psychopathology Fanon sought to overcome, and not the figure of global revolution. Gates leaves little doubt that although these tensions between Fanon, the psychoanalyst, and Fanon, the theorist of revolutionary change, are in evidence in Les Damnés de la Terre, they are very much more pronounced in Pour Noir Masque Blanc, and glaringly apparent in the movement between the two books. This is where Gates's itinerary brings us, to an understanding that in betraying its own floundering between psychoanalytic and colonial discourse, Fanon's work also betrays the inadequacy of the colonial paradigm for understanding the expressions of power relations today. Having displaced the figure of Fanon as the transnational global theorist par excellence, with that of Fanon, the black man from Martinique, the European interloper in third world affairs, Gates drives the point home with a quote from the newly figured man. In no fashion should I undertake to prepare the world that will come later. I belong irreducibly to my time. This proviso, significantly enough from Black Skin, White Mask, authorizes the abandonment of the project of global theory, now recognizably imperial, whose model of totality threatens to annihilate the particularities of expression that articulate thought in its specific locality. This preferring local thought to global theory is presented as a more historical engagement with our current conditions than what is fascinating about Fanon for the disciplinary enclave of the critique of imperialism. It is not a question of whether or not to embrace Gates's reading of Fanon over Said's. It is a question of how to read them together on Fanon, which is suggest how to read Fanon. And this is the crux of it for Gates, to correct how Fanon has been read, to draw a sharp distinction between the figure of Fanon read within the field of anti-imperialist theory and the Fanon he wants to read. But read within what field? The answer is given in the closing sentence of Critical Fanon, where it is concluded that disregarding the imperial agenda of global theory requires a recognition that we too, just as much as Fanon, may be fated to rehearse the agonisms of a culture that may never earn the title of post-colonial. Just as an aside, at the risk of losing a second or two, we need to keep in mind that Gates' explicit project, and he goes on in the New Yorker to express this, is to align Black studies with American exceptionalism and American imperialism, and to foreclose on all possibilities of radicalism. The first target being the Black arts movement and Black radicalism, and then generally all radicalism. Post-colonial is the last word in Gates' text, and the footnote attached to it explains that what is to be opted for instead of global theory is further psychoanalysis of race, trauma. Most useful than the dialectic of colonizer-colonized expressed in Les Dames de la Terre is the dialectic of subjective consciousness expressed in Black Skin, White Mask. Fanon's work then is thus divided so that his early and late works cannot be simply conflated, a conflation that invests heaviest in the oppositional global theorist of the later Algerian work. A striking shift of terrain attends this bifurcation of Fanonia. Fanon, the theorist of global resistance, the universal oppositional intellectual, is displaced by Fanon, the historicized theorist of Black identity, and Black identity is situated in the West, more precisely in the Americas. The concern with Fanon, then, is with the distinction between ways of understanding the expression of thought and organization of knowledge. This distinction is between a global epistemology that understands thought in the abstract, and the local historicism that deploys psychoanalysis in order to situate thought in a particular circumstance. Now, I'm going to jump ahead, because I think Edward offers an interesting and challenging interpretation of this in what follows in his own work. So that this distinction between a race-focused local historicism and the global opposition of epistemology puts a definite spin on Gates' characterizing Said's reading of Fanon as the preeminent expression of Fanon, the global theorist. Not to put too fine a point on it, when we travel with Gates through colonial discourse theory, we follow an itinerary that remaps Said's earlier traveling theory. And this is not so much a remapping as it is a mapping over. Said's concern in traveling theory is to trace the itinerary of certain theories' transportation from the historical and cultural situations in which they appear to other historical and cultural situations in order to expose the inadequacy of certain postmodern theories of discourse and power, specifically that of Michel Foucault, to the oppositional critical consciousness. The issue is how Foucault's thinking on power, for instance, exhibits the tendency towards a theoretical over-totalization of social reality in its seeking to understand the complexity of that reality in the study of one variable. Of course, obviously then, Said is not doing what Gates claims he's doing, but is doing what Gates himself wants to steal from Said. That's what he's doing. And why? What's at stake in this? Well, it remains inadequate to the political work of oppositional thought to have this simple problem of transposition be the focus of the work. And here, a double inadequacy, I think, is exposed. And the relative facile transportation of theory within the academy also betrays the extent to which academic thinking is inadequate to an oppositional thought that seeks to address broad concerns of social justice. Within the broader context of social reality, the political function of academic thought is not critical opposition to those formations of power that repress or prohibit expression. On the contrary, academic thought, figured here as theoretical closure, participates in the curtailment of true oppositional thought. What I want to draw attention to is that Said's project in traveling theory is not merely to find a way to, as Beauvais put it famously once, study the translation of theories between cultural moments, reminding us not just of the contextual nature of theoretical production, but also of the intellectual responsibility to measure theory against social reality, so it does not totalize its object at the expense of its practical and scholarly effect. It is indeed, as Beauvais also says, to stretch out, to plot the itinerary of that discourse which will constitute and represent intellectuals in a way that escapes academic neutering by continually engaging in the concrete political struggles of social reality. In other words, in the very process of tracing the critical history of the political efficacy of theory in the academy, Said enacts the struggle to establish the political efficacy of one conception and practice of intellectual discourse. And in Traveling Theory, the explicitly cited figures of that discourse are Noam Chomsky, Antonio Gramsci, and not Fanon. Although it is of considerable significance that references to C.L.R. James in this regard keep recurring in Said's work from as early as 1975. The subsequent explicit reference to Fanon is in Representing the Colonized, and may indeed be susceptible to Gates' read of it as a rejoinder of Nibaba. Considered from this perspective, the difference in Gates and Said's reading of Fanon is revealed to be a struggle over the nature and function of the intellectual in the post-colonial world of global capital. And I won't repeat what I just said, that Gates' aim in that struggle is to establish North American exceptionalism. He wrote famously in the New Yorker issue preface that embracing George Bush the father's claim that this was a New World Order, and embracing the neoliberal position of the end of history, that the only culture available in the world was American culture. And when the world says American culture, it means James Brown and Michael Jackson. It means Black American culture. So we're in the air, and I will quote him, of African American exceptionalism. That's what's at stake in this perspective. Now, there is an eerie parallel between this banishment of oppositional Fanon from the field of Americana and the proclaimed New World Order, attended by the pronounced end of history, in which North American culture becomes dominant. What Gates has called elsewhere African American exceptionalism takes on particular significance in this instance as the generalizable model for conceptualizing the relationship between the local and the global. Are these terms in which the world is to be thought? One should ask. It warrants pointing out at this juncture that in focusing on the question of whether or not Fanon was himself or theorized the possibilities of the supranational or the stateless intellectual, critical Fanon draws attention to the possibilities of thinking in a global economy, only to then foreclose on those very possibilities by restricting thinking to the subjectivist myopia that can only move beyond the individual to the collective, like minds. Diaspora, essentialism. We have here the very petitio principi that Gilbert Simondon detected at the foundations of dominant Western philosophical tradition. The fallacy of assuming the individual as the basis for determining individuation. In its grossest expression, this is the fallacy of the primal unity. And thinking along its lines, there are individual subjective minds that somehow have come together in time, the catalyst of which is generally understood to have been either biological, the genetically encoded compulsion to society, or symbolic, the linguistic compelled formation of society. And they come together to constitute a collective or representational mind, to recall Durkheim's early reflections on this. This collectivity is taken to constitute a cultural unity that in aggregation with other such unities constitutes in turn the global sphere of multiculturalism. Such multiculturalism or multiculture determines in a definitive teleology the material expression of human consciousness. This is precisely what Said opposes with his insistence on reading Fanon's work as a continuity of thought extending beyond black-skinned white mass and including a genealogy of thinking, forever striving to discover more possibilities of expression. 3/4 of the way into his 1993 book, Culture and Imperialism, Said remarks that Fanon more dramatically and decisively than anyone expresses the immense cultural shift from the terrain of nationalist independence to the theoretical domain of liberation, where there is no explicit reference at all to be made to critical Fanon in this regard. This statement, if not a direct response to Gates, at the very least responds to his counter-reading of Fanon. In any case, Said continues, Fanon is unintelligible without grasping that his work is a response to theoretical aberrations produced by the culture of late Western capitalism, received by the Third World native intellectual as a culture of oppression and colonial enslavement. Now, certainly this expression is itself an elaboration on Said's earlier assessments of Fanon, which Gates found symptomatic of the tendency to depersonalize the colonized, reducing him or her to a plurality. Contrary to Gates' claim, however, Fanon is not like Césaire. There's a line famously where Edward says in this long passage, which I haven't time to read, that indeed Fanon is like Césaire, and that Fanon is borrowing from Césaire certain notions about the man. Fanon is not like Césaire, but the expression of his thought performs a function analogous to Césaire's. What that function is gets expressed with Fanon's theory of violence. Edward writes, for Fanon, violence is the synthesis that overcomes the reification of white man as subject, black man as object. Said's conjecture is that while Fanon was writing Les Damnés de la Terre, he read Lukács's History of Class Consciousness, which had just appeared in Paris in French translation in 1960. This startlingly imaginative conjecture borders on the careless in its abrupt appearance without any supporting statements to indicate its being anything more than a willful thought. Said repeats this conjecture in a subsequent 1994 Raritan essay, Traveling Theory Reconsidered, where he tries to regain ground lost in the critiques of his 1982 Raritan essay, Traveling Theory, as well as respond to those who critique his conception of oppositional intellectuals as being thoroughly Eurocentric. Offering no firm evidence of transmission even there, he speculates on the relationship of Fanon's Les Damnés de la Terre to Lukács's History and Class Consciousness in terms of a genealogy of thought. The basis for that speculation is Said's recognizing in Fanon and Lukács's expression the same willful thought that constitutes true oppositional intellectual practice. In other words, Fanon, like Lukács, is concerned with accounting for the processes of individuation functioning in capitalist modernity, as well as the types of mind, dare I say it, psychologies it engenders. This genealogy, I think, is one of the lineages of thought descended from the 1955 Bandung Conference our Amr Mufti sought to delineate for us so nicely yesterday. Situating Fanon in its movement, I am inclined to concur with my friend Mufti that there is a discernible Marxist aspect to this line, one apt to be characterized by Stephen Broner in his account of the political economic milieu in which Lukács wrote History and Class Consciousness, as the focused philosophical attempt to restore the subjective moment, consciousness, as an integral moment in the revolutionary transformation, without at the same time annihilating the objective structures and determinations of social existence through which such consciousness is filtered. I'm about done. To that extent, we are singing the same tune, Mufti and I, the judge and I. But in a melodic, harmonic dissonance. I haven't got my glasses on. Is Mufti here? No, alhamdulillah. To that extent, we are singing the same tune, the judge and I, but with a melodic harmonic dissonance. This has to do with the fact that Said's analogy between Fanon and Lukács's projects focuses on the loss of the integrity of liberal humanism subject. The crucial concept for what Said characterizes as Lukács's insurgent and heretical Marxism is the separation of subjective consciousness from the world of objects, which can only be overcome by an act of mental will, by which one lonely mind can join another, by imagining the common bond between them, breaking the enforced rigidity that kept human beings as slaves to tyrannical outside forces. Insofar as the social reality is the material history of the subject-object dialectic, an historical understanding of the forms of thought that ceaselessly discloses the aporia, ruptures, and seams in those forms in relation to social reality, that discovers not only the conditions of repression, but also the possibilities of resistance. In these terms, willful intellectual work functions as the agency by which the relationship between expression and social formations attending capitalism are disclosed, revealing the real conditions in which subjective consciousness has its particular expression. It discovers the ways in which thought itself is liberating. This is the way in which Said understands oppositional thought, and so views Fanon as functioning like Lukács in his grounding Les Damnés de la Terre in the subject-object dialectic, and understanding the necessary agency for the synthesis that overcomes reification and dehumanization to be the mental act of will, willful thought. But when we relate this to Lukács's theorization of the proletariat as the personification of the commodity, as the concrete social existence of the commodity, and relate this to Fanon's theorization of the native Negro as the personification of the violence constitutive of capitalist modernity from the start, that is, as the concrete social existence of capitalist modernity's violence against living, we can readily discern in Lukács's theorization a decidedly Aristotelian hylomorphism. In other words, the lineage in which Said relates Fanon to Lukács remains bound up in the ancient fatal air of delineating the human from the living on the premise of primal unity. The momentum for the violence challenging colonialism is indeed not found in the structures of nationalism of any sort, here inclusive of ethnicity and race, but also religion, but in the open-ended affective engagement with reality. Any consideration of Fanon's attempt to overcome the opposition of idealist and materialist predication through affect must, however, examine his investigation of the processes of individuation, a phrase he deploys explicitly following Jung in Black Skin, White Mask, in which consciousness emerges as the event of experience. Affect has a definite epistemic status in Fanon's thought as the expression of an order of consciousness that is extra representation. Thank you.
I want to thank Paul for inviting me to this wonderful event. It's great to see his many friends soon to be back. Paul asked me to speak about this topic, the question of Tibet and Orientalism. The paper is not about Tibet itself, because I don't think I know enough about Tibet, but about the question about our idea of Tibet and Orientalism. So in a way, it's about reception of Said in China. So hopefully I'll come back to, I'll end with some reflections on Said's reception in China. But let me begin with a piece of news. It is reported that on August 1st this year, a multi-million-dollar drama, Princess Wenton, premiered in Lhasa. It tells the story of Wenton, the daughter of Tong dynasty emperor, and her marriage to Tibetan king in the mid-7th century, that historians have called the High Tang period in the Tang dynasty. It is said that their marriage allowed Tibet to enter a period of unprecedented development, not just in its economy, but also in its religion, art, and literature. Princess Wenton did not just give herself to the king of Tibet. She brought with her a dowry of the most up-to-date culture and civilization achievements in China at the time. Wenton's marriage has been held as a milestone event that has been cited as evidence of China's historic ownership of and sovereignty over Tibet. There have been various theatrical and filmic productions of this legendary 7th century princess. But what has made this particular one, this drama, a special event, is the way and the manner in which it is presented. It's a live dramatic spectacle that is performed on a giant stage, nearly 100 meters long, involving a cast of 600 actors and actresses in a replica of Potala Palace, built especially for the staging of the drama. The fake palace is over 24,600 square meters, and it could accommodate about 3,900 people. Facing the real historic structure, the former residence of the Dalai Lama, it creates a mirage and illusion of reality in which the temporality of Tibet is reversed and the cityscape of Lhasa is reorganized. The drama itself has been drawn a staggering investment of 750 million yuan, the largest ever and by far the most expensive dramatic production in China. It is reported that the drama will be performed every other day as long as the weather permits. It looks as though it would become a permanent feature of the city, a major tourist attraction, as the laser show performed at 8:00 p.m. over the Victoria Harbour in central Hong Kong. This grand live action show, an integrated spectacle of drama, music, and dance, is an apt reminder of the sumptuous musical epic, the East Raid, the theatric celebration of the triumph of the Chinese Revolution in 1965, and the grand opening of the Beijing Olympics, a spectacle interweaving ideological dogmas with historic narratives of China's civilizational achievements. The grand drama is an ostentatious display of modernity's triumph, an allegory of social progress that Tibet has achieved, especially in the post-revolutionary period. And perhaps more significant than Princess Wenton's marriage nearly 1,500 years earlier. It is only through the state-organized efforts that Tibet has entered a period of unprecedented development. Now, the question of Tibet, as it is commonly referred to in official documentation and scholarly discussion, is intensely emotional, not just for those who went through the Chinese Revolution, but for younger generations whose formations are defined by the factors of globalization for two separate but not unrelated reasons. First, Tibet is normatively included in China, whose sovereignty over Tibet has never been in any doubt, though whose control over it might not have been always firm and certain because of foreign interventions. Second, Tibet has been understood as a battlefield where China's struggle to contend, to limit, and to overwhelm external influences continues. In one sense, Tibet is a transference, a redirection of nationalistic anger which is rooted in and constantly renewed by the historic memories of the national humiliations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A firm grip on Tibet would be a symbolic revenge and a catharsis, perhaps. Tibet is therefore a colosseum where a new great game is unfolding. Admittedly, the question of Tibet is, in one obvious sense, a creation of historic Orientalism. There have been copious critical and historic studies of how Tibet is created and transformed into a Shangri-La, a timeless and a placeless utopia and an endangered archive of the human past, in a collective narrative developed over the past several centuries by committed missionaries, ambitious adventurers, imperialist agents, and New Age spiritualists. British imperialism played a singular role in the constitution of this Orientalism about Tibet, of what Said has called a corporate institution in which to speak about and to deal with Tibet. British Empire led two official missions to Tibet, which brought to the world the image of Tibet not just as a pure land, but also as a backwater that needed to be enlightened or occupied, or to be enlightened through occupation. The first one was led by George Bogle in the late 18th century. During the winter and the spring of 1774 and 1775, dispatched by British colonial governor Warren Hastings in India, the Scotsman George Bogle entered Tibet 2 decades before Lord Macartney's failed mission to China in 1792. In the late 18th century, Britain just began to establish and consolidate its control over India, and to expand its territorial and commercial interests led to Bogle's exploration of Tibet as a possible backdoor to China. No formal agreement was reached between Tibet and the British India, but Bogle established friendly relations with the ruling elites of Tibet, in particular the Panchen Lama. The second mission, just a very quick sort of replay of the history here, the British idea of, of Tibet. The second mission, led by Frantz's young husband in the early 20th century, was an outright military invasion. In the closing decades of the 19th century, British Empire participated in what was to be called the Great Game to constrain and to limit Russia's expansion in Central Asia. Young husband and his soldier saw a different Tibet, a backwater, a god-forsaken place. Its cold, the discomfort, the desolation were oppressive. End quote. The imperialist orientalizing of Tibet is not uniformly an imagining of Tibet as a Shangri-La, a pure state of civilization that could only be dreamed of as an object of nostalgia in modernity. Scholars have noted the importance of these two missions in the historic development of our idea of Tibet. When Bogle crossed the Himalayas, the Enlightenment played a significant role in shaping British views of geography and other peoples and cultures. When young husband's invasion took place, a popular imperial ideology modulated the British views of the world. However, what is not sufficiently noted and discussed is the convergence of these two ideologies. A more recent Orientalist discovery was made in the post-imperialist age. The New Age movement contributed to the revival of Tibetan Buddhism. I'm sure many of you in this room know better than I do. The image of Tibet as a utopia of inner life, a paradise of self-generation, and a place of ultimate escape from the depressions of modernity was sealed off by the PLA's entry into Tibet in 1959, which only confirmed the need to preserve its way of life and in particular its religious culture, Tibetan Buddhism, before its loss. Now, we know this is a well-established Orientalist history of Tibet, and it would be easy to attribute Tibet's present predicament to that history. But there wouldn't be the question of Tibet at present should there be no China's involvement in its development, even though this involvement might take the form of resistance and a counteraction against what it considers to be external Orientalism as responsible for the creation of the problem of Tibet. Resonant with the historic Orientalism that has created a timeless and non-developing Tibet, this indigenous Orientalism too identifies Tibet as the last place of anti-modernity. A widespread view held by both the government and its leading academic voices is that the entrenched social stagnation of Tibet is rooted in its religion, and religion and social modernity are radically incompatible. And Paul yesterday spoke about Wang Hui's essay about Tibet. I mean, this is actually the context in which this talk was presented. And those of you who read the paper, read essay by Wang Hui would recognize that some of these points that I'm engaging here with are taken from that essay. So they say religion, the entrenched stagnation of Tibet is rooted in its religion. Now, pressures are multiple and heavy on the reform of religion in Tibet. Contamination of its temples and the corruption of its monks are concurrent and in proportion with the commercialization of Tibetan life. Whether it would survive depends on whether it's ready and willing to reform itself, or compromise its control and relinquishing some of its power and attenuate its innate hostilities towards modernity's productive and transformative forces. Just as lure of consumer culture has transformed the Chinese society, they argue the will of reform in Tibet would be irreversible. Less manifest and immediate, but no less consequential, is the quiet erosion of Tibetan linguistic ecology. In the tide of commercialization and consumerism, the younger generation of Tibetans are far less keen to learn and use Tibetan. Fluent Chinese is a passport to job, money, and success. Language of instruction in primary schools in regional and municipal cities is Chinese. The Tibetan language courses may be on offer when and if in need. Only in smaller towns, counties, and especially rural areas is Tibetan used as the primary language of instruction. The gradual but steady attrition of Tibetan language users and a significant increase of Chinese language users have resulted from the expansion of the Chinese language supported and sustained by China's economic expansion and the government's language policy there. Similarities between the domination of Chinese in Tibet and of English globally are noted by scholars, including Wang Hui, without irony. The shrinking and reduction of Tibetan language is observed and commented on unsentimentally. There has been little discussion and analysis of the operation and consequences of Han linguistic hegemony. The global domination of English is established and expanded by British imperialism and the global English-speaking capitalism, but the domination of Chinese language in Tibet is seen as an inevitable result of modernization of Tibet, which needs to be fully integrated into a pan-Chinese market. Erosion of Tibetan religion and language is symptomatic of the ongoing radical alteration to the Tibetan way of life and its mode of being, of its culture in the sense Raymond Williams defines the term. A telling analogy is made between Tibet today and Imperial China in the late 19th century. Both were forced into a process of reluctant transformation, but the comparison is made without acknowledging the similarities between the role of Western Orientalism and China's understanding of its role in Tibet. The late Qing reform was precipitated and accelerated by global capitalistic imperialism. It was an external imposition and a reluctant choice that the Qing government could not make all by itself. Its collapse in the 1911 revolution ended its reform project. which in a sense would be only renewed in the late 1970s and which is now presented as a model of future development for Tibet. So reform and development led to an extraordinary concentration of power and amalgamation of state, administrative authority, and capital and market forces on the other hand. From the Pandora's box of a new liberal marketization, unexpected agents of a change and a transformation are unleashed. Fast economic development expansion has created a new class of the poor, the weak, and the underprivileged. Unlike historical imperial or colonial projects in the former colonies which were openly exploitative, China's neoliberal economic structure, with its massive concentration of capital in state enterprises and state-controlled projects of infrastructure, has created unprecedented difficulties and deprivations in historically underdeveloped areas and regions. Tibet is hit harder, and Tibetans are doubly disadvantaged and marginalized in the newly liberalized market, and that has taken hold on China. It is this everyday market practice, more than anything else, I think, that has done more damage to Tibetan life. The Tibetans are spectacularly unprepared to compete with their Han Chinese counterparts in almost all areas of work and production. The Tibetan author Wu Shou and her Han husband Wang Lixiong have written extensively about what the new liberal marketization has brought to Tibet. Just want to give you some examples, everyday examples, to show this. It would take a Tibetan tailor more than half a month to make a Tibetan robe, which in the hands of a Han Chinese tailor is only a matter of 2 or 3 days. To build a Tibetan-style house, a Tibetan contractor would need a year or so. He and his workers must be presented plenty of gifts in the process of construction for ensuring the quality of construction work. But a Han Chinese construction team would need just 2 or 3 months to get the job done, and in expectation of no gifts, no presents, no bribes, of no additional benefits beyond their payment that is agreed upon. In the city of Lhasa, taxis and rickshaws are mostly operated by Han Chinese. Automobile mechanics, cobblers, farmers are almost entirely Han Chinese. Half the Tibetan furniture in the Lhasa market is made by Han Chinese. Han Chinese have even begun to participate in the areas of a business that have been traditionally dominated by Tibetans, such as the running of Tibetan restaurants and the manufacturing of Buddha statues. It is widely known, according to Wu Shou and Wang, that in Lhasa, except a few very special areas of work, such as celestial burial, most jobs are now taken over and dominated by Han Chinese. What do Tibetans do? They rent their houses to Han Chinese who have come over to do business in Lhasa, and they themselves have stopped working, or rather are forced out of work in the market competition and live on the income of rentals. And we know this is a familiar story of modernity. Economic progress is concurrent with the disappearance of a tradition and local life, not necessarily the result of an overtly political project of colonization supported by state institutions, but by the market forces and consumerism. Even though it is true that this marketization is a conscious policy choice on the part of the government. China itself is paying a heavy price for the reforms, we know that. The underprivileged Han Chinese in the coastal regions, too, are victims of the country's new liberal economic policy and its practice, which has led to the creation of a land of injustice and inequality on a massive scale. The urban poor, patent migrant workers, the unemployed, deracinated local residents for property redevelopments, victims of epidemic corruption and state thuggery. I'm thinking of those petitioners who seek justice for themselves or for their abused relatives. It is estimated that there are regularly 1 million of them each year hanging on in Beijing to appeal to the authorities for the correction of miscarriage of justice. However, this is often used in defense of the state policy and market reform in Tibet. The argument is this: it's not just Tibet, but the whole nation needs to bear the pains of reform. And Tibet should not remain immune to the forces of modernization. And I find it hard, frankly, to comprehend the logic of this argument. Han victims are certainly victims of the reform, there's no doubt about that. But its widespread injustice must not be employed to justify inequalities between Tibetans and Hans. The suffering here is not legitimation of suffering there, or vice versa, but things must be far worse in Tibet. In addition to its internal class inequalities, the regional, historical, and ethnic divergences between Tibetan Qinghai Plateau and the southeastern China must have, this historical and ethnic divergences between these two regions must have contributed to deepening crisis, deepening inequalities with far-reaching political and social consequences in Tibet. And Wang Lixiong, I just quoted a little earlier, who lived in Tibet for several decades, he demonstrates with compelling evidence that the Han idea and image of Tibet are strikingly Orientalist, and probably more so than those found in historical Orientalist accounts. What is especially disturbing for me is this widespread everyday racism that many Han Chinese would not recognize or acknowledge. Tibetans are commonly considered second class. Even a Han manual worker in Lhasa would think of himself as superior to Tibetans. One reports, the author reports, that long-distance coaches running between Qinghai and Tibet are a movable exhibition of Han racism. Han passengers do not conceal their contempt for their fellow Tibetan passengers in these coaches. And Tibetans are openly described as dirty and smelly and are told by the driver or conductor to take rear seats. Once Wang, the author, refused to let the Tibetan passenger sitting by him leave and take a rear seat, surrounding Han Chinese passengers quickly evacuated their seats and moved away, leaving Wang and the Tibetan passenger segregated from other Han passengers. Think about this. It would not be possible, I think, to imagine a Parks trial in the US in 1955 and a Montgomery bus boycott in China. For racial segregation is not a state policy. Right? And I think it should be acknowledged that the CCP has done much to eradicate racial discrimination among its cadres, as it would be ideologically not acceptable to make that distinction between Han Chinese and Tibetans. And yet, this racism is pervasive. It is this popular and almost unconscious racism that is more unsettling and harder to eradicate. Reform and marketization have activated, in other words, for me, a local Orientalist racism or a racist Orientalism, whose most immediate revelation is its argument for economic progress and development, which is institutionally and socially supported with money and technology to carry out infrastructure construction and large-scale urbanization projects. The idea of reforming and modernizing Tibet articulates a particular form of Sino-Orientalism, or if you like, a new Orientalism and an internal Orientalism. It converges with the Enlightenment ideology, and as such, it is an Orientalist mimesis that is presented in a language of protection and patronage. Though it is recognized by some, this silent Orientalism is never openly questioned or contested. Now, such internal Orientalism has its foreign supporters. Ezra Vogel, the retired professor from Harvard, in his Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China, considered Tibetans to be anti-modernizers, and their current predicament as having derived from their resistance to reform to join Tibet toward greater integration into the national economy and the culture. But Tibetans, Vogel says, have taken advantage of economic opportunities generated by inputs of Chinese economic assistance to Tibet. And this is probably a reference to the central government's fiscal support of Tibet. In 1980, Hu Yaobang, then the Secretary General of the CCP, visited Tibet and said in Lhasa that since 1951, the central government had injected into Tibet a total of 4.5 billion renminbi, nearly 100 times more than the Tibetan government's tax revenue, total tax revenue, over the same period of time. So 100 times more than what they can possibly get from their own production. And this does not count the government's investment in its infrastructure, such as roads, railways, airports, hospitals, schools, etc. Now, these figures often cited as illustration of how Tibet has benefited from economic opportunities generated by inputs of Chinese economic assistance to Tibet are, for me, an uncanny reminder of the white man's burden that legitimated and moralized and motivated 19th century imperialism as an enlightenment and a humanitarian project. China's own Orientalized history must have a direct bearing on its present understanding of its relations with the world, especially the West. Silent Orientalism particularly manifests at a time when its dramatic rise on the international scene is one of triumphant modernity and has enabled its triumphant coming back with a revengeance, perhaps, after a prolonged time of humiliations and defeats. In this discourse of modernity, Tibet is defined as an anomaly, a deviant, and another to China's present social and economic projects. Regional divergences must be flattened, and Tibet must be transformed, not just for its own survival, but for demonstration of the success of Chinese model of modernity. The drama Princess Wenten that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk is a graphic illustration of what reform would be able to accomplish and achieve. Silent Orientalism thrives on the country's growing economic strengths and influence on the global stage. It is about present-day China in relation to the world and in relation to itself, to its past, and to its ethnic minorities in particular. I think this is all about that. And its critique of external Orientalism conceals and masquerades a nationalism, and it is an alibi for nationalism. Now, at this point, let me just quickly return to Said. It is, I think, relevant to mention, to turn to Chinese academics' ambivalence about historical Orientalism. A major complaint about Saidian critique of it, i.e. historical Orientalism in China, is what is seen by it as its neglect of China as an exception to historical Orientalism. There has been an attempt to rescue Enlightenment Orientalism in China, which, resting on the monumental intellectual authority of the 18th century thinkers and writers such as Voltaire and Rousseau, is the culture source of the political legitimacy of China, not just in terms of its model of social and economic development, but also in its choice of political and governmental structure in Tibet. In the case of Tibet, this Enlightenment Orientalism is rescued not so much for disputing Said as some sinologists have done in the past, but for its mimesis, for the creation of a language of modernity, progress, and reason in which discuss the question of Tibet. The idea of China model has been in vogue for some time now. So the New York Times has published a collection of views on the China model as alternative to liberal democracy, from Confucian constitutionalism to Chinese meritocracy. China has embraced global capitalism, or global capitalism has embraced China as the workshop and the market of the world. Its Enlightenment Orientalism demonstrates the power and the force of global capitalism that is not managed by just one state, but by global structure of capital as empire. So I think the resolving of the Tibet question, if it is a question, is intertwined with the problem of China's own democracy. One could only hope that it would come once China's transformation is accomplished and its social and political structure is thoroughly rationalized. I just want to conclude very quickly here. In the summer of 1988, when I first met Edward Said at the School of Criticism and Theory at Dartmouth, as far as I know, there had been not a single study of his work in Chinese. He was virtually unknown in the Chinese Academy. Orientalism began to receive attention in the 1990s, but mostly through post-colonial studies. By some, he's accepted and recognized as an intellectual hero, a model of intellectual work that engages with profound political and social issues. And by others, he's blamed for not exempting China from Western Orientalist thinking about the non-West because of its privileged position in the Enlightenment discourse as a model of civilizational development in Europe. But Said, in these two cases, is mostly employed and used as critical opposition to Western imperialism and Orientalism. Other aspects of his critical writing, like we were talking about this morning, and his critical practice other aspects of that have attracted very little attention. And this neglect in China is symptomatic of what is wrong, not just with the reception of Edward Said in China, but with its academy as a whole, I think, which offers to work closely with the structures of authority and power. Some of its leading figures participate in the production of a language for modernity and development through neoliberal marketization. The result is a Chinese Orientalism turned into an intellectual hegemony. Nowhere more evident is this intellectual Orientalism at work than its views on Tibet and its current status in China. As Said warned at the end of Orientalism, trouble sets in when the guild tradition of Orientalism takes over the scholar who is not vigilant, whose individual consciousness as a scholar is not on guard against received ideas or too easily handed down in the profession. Said's critical engagement is to speak truth to power on behalf of the oppressed and the marginalized, the speechless and the silent in face of those in power, as the intellectual's responsibility and the political inner conscience. What he has said about intellectual needs to be, I think, remembered, repeated, and practiced, especially at this historic conjuncture of China's rise.
Bruce. Ronald, a very small thing. When you're looking for, when you mentioned Lukács in a kind of speculative moment of the French translation, I thought it might be worth, for that moment and perhaps a little bit more generally, to get Sartre's name into this, because I think Fanon got his Hegel from Sartre before, rather than from Lukács. You need the Lukács for that. And I actually think when we're thinking about the model of Orientalism, Sartre is a major figure whose name hasn't been brought into the conversation yet. So Sartre as a figure possibly generating some interesting triangular thought when we're thinking about Fanon and Said.
Yeah. I used to think as well that it's commonplace that Sartre is the source of Fanon's Hegelianism. But I no longer think that. That leaves open what's interesting about why Edward sees him in Lukács. I want to explore what's going on. We still won't. I need to get to the archives in France. But one reason I don't think it is I've been very carefully looking through Sartre's work. I'm trying to get his clinical work. Black Skin, White Mask, in this particular instance. And his using of the phrase, d'approbation, d'individuation, in the context of talking about young. Right? And the way in which the Martiniquais achieves a particular kind of persona. And how that is so much not only at odds with Sartre, right, but opened up a whole question of where is this thinking coming from, right? Now I'll say that I presented this at UCLA, not this talk, but another talk in which I invoked that passage, and Vlad said to me, you need to read Simondon, right? And so I've been reading Simondon, and also then Ignacia Myers and Durkheim, and I'm finding a clear evidence in Fanon's own formation to that discourse as a source of his particular critique of Hegel, which can account for why he so disagreed with Sartre on this. Right? And that then makes Edward's engagement interesting in a different way. Clearly I disagree with him, but it's interesting in terms of the kind of genealogy that I'm trying to get at that's in play here, and frees us up from Sartre, which also frees us up to explore what I think is really important for Fanon in this question, and that is how we think the human, in which he and Sartre did not disagree. So I'm saying thank you, but
okay, thank you.
This is why not.
keep the conversation going. I thought both talks were fantastic. I want to ask a question about the way in which a mimetic Orientalism gets deployed by the Han Chinese in the construction of Tibetans. If it is indeed a mimetic Orientalism, that is, it's an Orientalism that has always already produced a displacement from within, is that notion of Orientalism also unstable enough to shift back on those who are deploying it? That is, once you use and deploy a notion of Orientalism, that is Enlightenment Orientalism, as a kind of benchmark, a point of departure, and you're deploying it tactically under erasure, and imposing it on a specific, let's call it racial formation in China. Does the racial formation, having been saturated with that by the state, have that as one of its counter or oppositional tropes? Has it been endowed by the state through that very strategy of mimetic Orientalism with a whole tropology?
This is very interesting. I mean, I find the whole thing so complex because if you think of the state ideology, this is clearly racial discrimination or distinction is not acceptable because obviously the communist ideology would advocate a certain equality among different ethnic minorities, but yet this Enlightenment ideology is accepted in the academy as well, right? And used as a strategy in support of the state policy in marketization, in reforming. So I find this hugely complex. There is something, is not so consistent, not always consistent. Yeah.
Well, the moment in which you suggest that Fanon becomes the site at which a certain understanding for Said of the constitutive violence of capital is simultaneously imposed yet disavowed, does that moment complicate the prior description of Said's relationship to Skip Gates in terms of the logics of critical Fanonism and the genealogy that you're proposing? You're disqualifying his use of Lukács in order to, which you say is a mistake. It is careless from a scholarly standpoint because you don't find evidence for it. But is he, by way of that tactic, producing an account of violence that is necessarily refuting the Gates folding in Said within a specific critical genealogy of Fanonism?
Yeah, I must apologize for the obscurity of my presentation, because I wasn't saying that Edward was wrong because he was scholarly careless. I was saying precisely that Edward, in taking up Fanon as being analogous to Lukács, overlooks Fanon's theorization of violence. And where Edwards invested in Lukács' theorization of the proletariat marks an investment in two types of mind that come out of modernity, the bourgeoisie of the proletariat, and in so doing, overlooking the native and the Negro, which is another type of psychology that emerges, which there is not an adequate account of. And the analogy between Fanon and Lukács not only does not offer that account, it preempts it. And so I'm introducing Fanon's question of violence, right, as a way of exploring this, right, where we understand violence is also a fundamental force and function of modernity, and not just the market in an abstract sort of way. And yes, that does then challenge the Gatesian account, but I'm saying Edwards more This is where he and I diverge.
Ron, I don't really recognize the side that you're describing here in the passages on Fanon. No, the passages on Fanon, I mean, it's neither some diffuse account of where he gets his Hegelianism, as I recall now. I haven't looked at them in a while. Nor certainly this kind of foreclosure that you're describing. I mean, the way I recall it is, actually Joe and I were talking about this last night. The way I recall it is that Said thinks that the figure of the native in Wretched, for instance, is not some empirically demarkable social agent, okay, but a kind of imputed consciousness in the way in which the proletarian consciousness is a kind of imputed consciousness in history and class consciousness. And so in some ways it seems to me that this comparison would precisely make possible the larger intellectual or psychological sociology, let us say, of modernity that you just described in the last sentence, which is to say, to supplement in some way, I don't mean in the deconstructionist sense, but to supplement in some ways the account of a split modernity between bourgeois and proletarian consciousness, right, with this figure of the native. And what Said is really kind of interested in is what kind of a figure is the native for Fanon?
Yeah. Yes. Firstly, I did not in my reading even suggest that Said is finding Fanon getting cabled into the couch. Right?
No, you didn't suggest that. It came up in conversation.
Right. But in fact, as you well know, Said does draw this explicit analogy between Fanon and Lukács along the lines of a way of thinking, right? Which is in step with what you're suggesting. The problem I have is I'm calling for a much more severe epistemic break. That it's not enough to take
break with?
It's not enough to take Lukács theorizing of proletarianization as an instance of the concrete existence, right, of the commodity, social existence of the commodity, as the conceptual model for understanding the discrete processes by which particular individual consciousness is produced or psyches are produced. There's another genealogy and another archive. And this is what I'm arguing. I mean, the beginning for this. So I'm saying, yes, there is a certain, indeed, similarity, exactly along the lines you're taking, but it's not adequate enough. I'm not dismissing it, but I'm saying you've got to push further. And that's when I talk about the question of violence, which he doesn't do. Right? Which he doesn't, to mark that we have to look at it from a totally different point of departure. And this is where pushing back to the Platonic moment. I mean, look, the point of departure for all of this is my strong disagreement with the way in which Albert Memmi's characterization of Fanon has become dominant. And the principal problem is Albert Memmi says explicitly that Fanon is only trying to escape his negritude, and that it's impossible for him to become this kind of ongoing self-autopoietic consciousness. Now, what I'm focusing on is precisely that negritude, that what Fanon is exploring in Black Skin, White Mask, and in Wretched, and in the notes I've seen of the clinical notes he's doing, he's looking at this in a very specific way in Algeria, is the way in which that very Negroness constitutes a kind of dynamic of psychic development that cannot be accounted for by any of the epistemic premises of modernity as we know it in a certain philosophical tradition. It's not anti-enlightenment, it's not anti-humanist. It's to say that there's another lineage that isn't elaborated, and yes, that while Edward comes close to it, his adherence to Lukács in this example marks his inability to move over. And in fact, there's a line where Edward says, interestingly enough, that there have been those who've been able to cross over. When he's saying, not all Westerners can't deal with this, and he marks Memmi as one of those who crosses over, marking Memmi's outsiderness, but at the same time marking Fanon's outsiderness. And that's what I am trying to follow. Right? So yeah, there's a different reading. My reading has a very specific edge to it. To say this does not go far enough. We need to go further, right? Yeah. Right, and that we need to take up completely alternative archive and way of thinking, calling it a thinking in disorder. No. That guy.
First Bruce, and then Andre.
One of the things, QS, that I liked about your talk is when you were talking about the Western version of Orientalism that has projected various identities onto Tibet. It seemed to me that your telling of that story was consistent with a story according to which Tibet would not be an other, but would be a version of us that would be the legitimate subject of self-determination, so that one can, as a Westerner, not treat place X as other, according in a way to the Orientalist, or the one version of Orientalism, but in fact say, we support the self-determination of place X because they are exactly like us and they deserve self-determination the same way we deserve self-determination. So, in a way, that was part of my bringing Hegel up as a problem in Orientalism and in Fanon. That is the large question of what is the logic by which we think selves have to produce others? And where does our thinking on that stand at this moment? And the reason, in a way, I threw Sartre into that was less because everyone knows that he was a huge influence of sorts on Fanon, but because he's been brought up as a possible influence on Orientalism. And it to me is a question of whether some of the ways of taking Orientalism might reproduce Sartrean mistakes, producing a certain notion of necessary relationship, which say would not be open to this broader sense of selves do not necessarily have to produce others. There can be forms of imperialism, let's say, that do not work that way at all, but are consistent with universal principles and so on and so forth. It's not really a question, it's just an attempt at self-clarification.
No, I think, I mean, this question, self and other, I mean, here, of course, I'm not concerned with that. I mean, it's always, this new Orientalism, as far as I can see, is the employment of historical Western Orientalism that can be used to develop a certain political agenda that is reform, progress, and development. So it's if you like, a sort of really historical resources here for them to use. And yet, what complicates the whole thing is that in the use of this historical form of Orientalism, the West is rejected. Right? And this is where I find it's mostly unsettling and problematic. I don't know how to. I mean, how to respond to that question. That is to get away from to get away from this self and other dichotomy. I mean, it's for me. It's and also the self the issue of self-determination for Tibet is another issue. I didn't talk about this, but I didn't enter upon this issue because I think it's so hard to speak about it here, because the issue of full independence for Tibet is a historical issue as well, and we know that there's so much that is going on in terms of Tibet. Each side can always cite historical documentation in support of Tibetan's territorial status. So I didn't just avoided that particular problem. Thinking about
This is a most welcome intervention. For the fact that I got to bed at 3 o'clock last night because Mufti kept me up too late plying me with liquor to befuddle my mind, I would respond with even greater enthusiasm. Of course, it's an appropriate question. It's an appropriate question. And of course, one of the key points of the dispute between Fanon and Sartre is about this question. And you forget that Frantz is a much more powerful influence on Fanon's thinking, as is in evidence in his style of thinking, than is Sartre. Sartre is a counterpoint, right? And the dispute is precisely Fanon's insistence that the question is not how the self thinks the other, but what are the possibilities? How can we think the self differently? And Sartre's conception of even absolute freedom and the necessity is still grounded in this position that what makes us distinctive as entities is the thinking, right? And it creates a fundamental rupture between thinking and living, thinking and life. Right? And this is why tracing Fanon's engagement with Ponty, tracing why he deploys Jung in a certain way, allows one to see that that's where the influence is, where he's going back to this question of what is the human? What are we? Right? Which Sylvia so nicely captures in her focusing on the call for epistemic rupture at stake in his elaboration of something called sociogenesis. So this is indeed the question, right? Because as long as we're caught in this issue of how the self can think the other, right, and how we can then think derivatively about freedom and justice, these fundamental concepts, we repeat the same problem. And so, Taylor tells us that in the late 70s that the third world struggles were about the struggle of recognition, taking us back to a Hegelian moment. That's a wrong turn. And that's a turn that takes us away from Fanon. Completely.
So Anstoßen and Stasis, and we will stop this session.
This is to actually both of you. I was thinking about the question of race and how Orientalism, often in colonial contexts, also operated as some sort of an invitation to some sort of emancipation by the actual embracing of a self. And, for instance, if one would think about the caste system, the so-called caste system in India, described by Dumont as the most perfect theodicee in the world. Now, if this is, in historical terms, an abstract structure of identity that has been imposed, it was also in terms of the workings of the colonial state, an invitation to assume some of these identities, which people took. So if you are talking about a general mass of humanity, often it was within their interests to invent fictitious, and I think it's written on this, invent fictitious caste histories, abjure alcohol and meat, and actually become a caste in that process. Actually assume a self of marked by subservience. Now, what these histories of formations, histories of self-formations and things like that, what these histories also tend to erase is the violence that accompany these embracing of selves and identities, and the violence that keeps marking the way in which these communities sort of very tenuously hang on to these identities, throughout sort of successive historical constellations of events. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
But I, in this talk, I'm concerned with what I would call, for the lack of a better term, popular racism, and I don't know how to describe this more accurately. I see this. This reminds me of what Bruce was talking about. Something that was developing in China, something that is shaping.
I'm just going to take 2 seconds to clarify. Is it also a part of this official Orientalism to invite Tibetans to become Tibetans proper in a certain sense? Or, sort of to fulfill a certain destiny that
apparently is waiting for them.
The official self-understanding.
Yes.
No, so this is the problem. I mean, I don't know how to. Well, communist ideology, by definition, I mean, does not accept the racism. That's the whole point. If you look at the party, charter or any constitution, there isn't any. I mean, I think if you look at the Chinese constitution document, racism is not. I would have to say, I mean, I was brought up in this kind of ideology, which we were taught not to have developed it. But yet you see the pervasive practice of this sort of racism, and that is what is troubling that response one. Secondly, historically, I haven't got time to speak about this racism. It's not just something that you would see now. It has had a long history, even in Qing dynasty. And I was reading this document preparing this talk. I mean, I was reading some materials and found. The Qing emperor's son was sent to Tibet, and he wrote a scathing poem about Tibetans, and you could see that's completely racist. If you look at that, it's amazing. This is the 18th century, so it's not about Han Chinese. It's about Manchu. So I think it's there, but one more thing I want to say is this. I mean, that's why I see a lot of a critique of this. I mean, what is going on in China in relation to Tibet is everything is attributed to the communist ideology, and I don't see that. I see a fissure here, a break between the state ideology and what is practiced at the popular level, and that is what is bothering to me.
Anastasis is a question, so I'll be very brief. In answer to your question, I can't speak of Tibet, so I'll paraphrase, right? Is it the case that certain deployments of Orientalism require that one or enable one to become a proper Muslim? Yes. And there's plenty of substantial evidence for that, right? And people have remarked it. Olivier points this out 20 years ago in remarking that Islamicism is a fairly neoliberal construction that is frankly an iteration of a process of subject formation that attends a crisis in modernity associated with the Reformation. And we can see this. I mean, so yes, it's doing that, right? And it has precisely to do with the question of the proper, of the proper, which Vlad spoke to. That's what I'm jumping onto. Just so you can go look on your own without going any further. Nabil Perez and James Baldwin in Passage d'Occident challenge precisely this notion of the proper to try to argue for a way of thinking the self that is improper. And it's caught up in all kinds of notions of vagabondage or what they call le mystique, and which is different than Baba's notion of hybridity. And can you think a self that is disentangled from the proper? Right? And then what kind of self is that?
Ronald, I may have misunderstood what you were trying to do, but I was definitely perplexed by your answer, Amir. Because from what I remember, the discussion of Fanon is really a way that Amir presented it. It's about the imputed notion of the native. And then I thought, I have this damn thing with me, so I can double check. And sure enough, the reason why Said brings up Lukács in relation to Fanon is to show that Fanon goes beyond Lukács in not actually seeing this as a subject-object issue.
Right.
And by the way, the Hegelianism here, Fanon can take just as easily from Lacan. We'll never be able to resolve that issue. Because for Said, Fanon is important above all in one specific way, his critique of nationalism, and especially post-colonial nationalism. That is the thing that he's concerned with more than anything in Fanon. And here, I think that although theoretically, I agree with your impetus in the way that you're trying to envision this alternate kind of epistemology, perhaps. I don't know if it's entirely appropriate to Fanon. At least it seems to me that you're implying a continuity from black skin, white masks to wretched of the earth. Are you doing that? Because I don't think there is one.
All right. Of course you're perplexed. First thing. You understand?
Good.
And indeed in the longer version, I elaborate or emphasize Edward's investment in Fanon for critique of nationalism. And even in the version I gave you, that's the way in which his reading of Fanon is a foil against Gates's nationalism,
You're right.
to offer up a clear expose of the nationalism behind a certain notion of African American exceptionalism and even diaspora. Going on to the question of the epistemic rupture, my point is really quite simple. Sure, Edward does that. That's his preoccupation with Fanon, hands down. I'm done with that, we move on. Edward's reading of Fanon will not take us into an elaboration of a radical humanism that gets us out of the trap of the philosophical tradition traceable back to, one could arguably say, Democritus. And that's my investment. And yes, in trying to do that, I think Fanon helps us. Not only do I, in my reading of Fanon, Fanon's black skin, white mask through not just Wretched of the Earth, but into his writing in Mujahid as an elaboration of this, right? Especially his notes coming from the south of Mali, where he's trying to argue for a different kind of conceptualization. Because he goes on to think about Africa in a broad sense. Yes, I'm doing that explicitly. But not only that, I situated even a longer genealogy of thinking differently that Fanon's engaging in, which is why I'm invested in what Negro is doing here. What is at stake in Mimi's resistance? Right, which even Edward recognizes in terms of his being, a Caribbean. I'm trying to challenge all of that and say, no, here's a performance, Fanon. Here's an enactment of a way of thinking and being that's human, that has nothing to do with these categories, that is precisely restless, and expressly so. Right? So there's not a real difference in our three readings of Fanon, of Edward reading Fanon. I'm just saying Edward's reading of Fanon is of minimal use. Full stop. It's useful to mark what's at stake in Gates's attack on Edward and how Edward is employed as a tool to crush radicalism, the radicalism I'm invested in. But Edward's reading is not going to take us far enough down the road. For all the things it does do, it doesn't do this for me.